Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today dives into a critical yet often overlooked dynamic, the interaction between an individual's internal moral life, their conscious ethical mastery, and the surprising depletion of their physical health when faced with overwhelming external constraints. We are analyzing material concerning individuals who have achieved significant self-regulation. We're talking profound dietary mastery or consistent ethical behavior, only to find their physical vitality, their immune function, and just overall resilience really start to erode when they are placed in highly restrictive environments. Think mandated protocols, isolation, or even severe financial instability.
And that context is so vital because it moves us beyond the traditional concepts of relapse or moral failure. The material specifically highlights the intense pressure people face when external structures govern their daily routines and just severely constrain their ability to make choices that align with their own known values. We're really looking at involuntary compromises here.
Precisely. And this leads us directly to our central question for today. Does the severe depletion of physical health under constraint primarily stem from the conscious ethical dissonance? That crushing experience of internal hypocrisy when you're inhibited from acting on what you know is right? Or is the depletion mechanism overwhelmingly one of generalized physiological stress that stems purely from the loss of autonomy and systemic control? Now, I will be arguing for the primacy of conscious ethical dissonance as the unique accelerant of this physical wear and moral fatigue.
And I'll contend that while, yes, the conscious recognition of misalignment undeniably causes immense psychological strain, the immediate and primary mechanism of physical health depletion, so the compromised immunity, the fatigue, the metabolic disruption, is the resulting chronic stress, the suppression of executive function, and the disruption of basic metabolic processes that are caused by the sheer unavoidable loss of agency. The body registers the threat of constraint, really regardless of the individual's specific moral framing of it.
Okay. Well, to start, let's just unpack my position a little. The central dynamic here is the tension between mastery, which includes conscious awareness, a deeply internalized knowledge of the right action, maybe years of established dietary discipline, and the constraint imposed by the system. This collision is not merely frustrating, it creates a profound internal contradiction. When a system forces outward compliance that contradicts the individual's intentional, mastered ethical or physiological practices, the very intentionality that accompanied that mastery it's effectively weaponized against the person's own integrity.
So you're suggesting that the individual's own capacity for self-reflection becomes the source of the internal harm?
Absolutely. This specific dissonance, which really manifests as a kind of structural hypocrisy, it doesn't just cause guilt, it simultaneously taxes the body, the brain, and moral reasoning. This is why the material points to a distinct depletion of moral and ethical energy alongside physical health. The system demands behavior that violates a consciously held standard, and that conscious violation accelerates physiological wear, it increases susceptibility to illness, and it contributes to the shortening of a perceived lifespan. The physical effects, increased cortisol, suppressed immunity, impaired digestion, they're all intensified by the specific cognitive load of recognizing the ethical strain. It is the conscious mind recognizing the systemic betrayal of its own integrity that extracts this severe and specific physiological toll.
Okay, I grant that this misalignment creates significant cognitive and psychological strain. I do. However, in terms of the physiological damage, I would caution against attributing the primary physical mechanism solely to that moral label. The material confirms that individuals experience fatigue, metabolic imbalance, and reduced resilience. My position is that the root cause initiates in the neurobiology of survival. When external control is prolonged and profound, as it is in, say, financial instability or institutional protocols, the nervous system adapts for immediate survival, and it overrides sophisticated executive functions like long-term health planning or adherence to internalized values.
So you're saying the physiological harm precedes the conscious moral reckoning.
It operates parallel to it, but the mechanism is fundamentally one of chronic stress adaptation. I mean, this chronic physiological stress, it activates HPA axis pathways, it floods the system with cortisol, and it systematically impairs foundational health pillars, reducing deep sleep quality, disrupting metabolic processes, and severely compromising the immune system. The resulting physical damage happens because the systemic constraint compromises the capacity for self-regulation. The body registers the inability to implement desired, healthy behaviors, say managing a complex dietary routine, as an existential threat, and that triggers chronic systemic stress. This stress occurs regardless of whether the individual frames the conflict as ethical dissonance or just a necessary temporary survival adaptation. And because of that, true physical recovery is achieved primarily through the restoration of choice and the resulting stress reduction, which allows for that neurobiological repair.
I see why you emphasize the generalized stress response, as it does provide a clear mechanism for physical depletion. However, if the depletion were purely generalized stress from loss of agency, we wouldn't see the specific secondary symptoms of identity fragmentation and the taxing of moral reasoning that are mentioned in the source material. I mean, these are not typical outcomes of purely physical duress. They are outcomes of a conscious ethical conflict.
Right, and I certainly grant that the feeling of identity fragmentation is real, but let's look closer at its source. That fragmentation stems from the cognitive dissonance created by the continuous suppression of one's values, desires, and intentions. When you are forced daily to do things you know are suboptimal, like eating institutional food that derails your dietary mastery, that cognitive struggle is intensely stressful. The physical harm results from the stress pathways that this dissonance activates. It's the conflict itself, the inability to align intention and action that is exhausting the system, not the specific moral label applied to the outcome.
But that is the core distinction, isn't it? The depletion isn't just cognitive exhaustion. It is linked specifically to the conscious self recognizing the proper course of action and being blocked. If an individual has mastered complex ethical or nutritional self-management, the system's inhibition of that practice becomes a structural imposition of hypocrisy. This conscious recognition accelerates the wear precisely because it pits a highly developed moral or intentional self against a paralyzed operational self. Generalized stress, like that caused by a loud noise or lack of sleep, doesn't generate the specific guilt or the feeling of diminished ethical self-efficacy that is tied to this kind of behavioral misalignment with a conscious, internalized ethical standard.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the moral weight of the conflict is the key physiological driver. That's a compelling argument regarding the psychological toll for sure. But if you consider that the material explicitly states this tension is not ethical failure in the traditional sense, the lack of condemnation is central here, because capacity and freedom are compromised. Since the action is compelled by circumstance, like being dependent on restricted housing or limited funds, it shifts the harm from the moral realm to the physiological realm of chronic inhibition. The physical harm, the suppression of immunity and overall vitality, it comes from the environment inhibiting alignment itself. The systemic limitations, whether financial instability or overly rigid protocols, they actively condition the person to inhibit their natural self-expression. And the body registers this loss of self-realization as a pervasive physical stressor that impairs essential recovery functions like digestion, immunity, and sleep.
Let's turn to regeneration then, because the path to healing should reflect the mechanism of harm. I believe the mechanism of harm requires a focus on restoring conscious integrity, which is what facilitates true regeneration. The power of intent is crucial here. The material notes that true ethical evaluation and capacity depend on awareness and intent. So when autonomy is restored, individuals can again align their behavior with their conscious moral and health understanding. This successful alignment restores not just psychological integrity, but also physical vitality and perceived lifespan.
I agree that health returns when autonomy is restored, but I would frame the causality quite differently.
How so? I mean, if aligning conscious conduct restores vitality, doesn't that prove the misalignment, the hypocrisy under constraint? was the specific source of depletion. The restoration of integrity actively protects physical health.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Recovery modules, they work to reestablish alignment simply by restoring agency and self-efficacy, which immediately addresses the underlying chronic stress response. When the individual regains control, even incremental control, cortisol levels drop, the nervous system shifts away from survival mode, and the body can finally allocate energy to repair functions. Regeneration is fundamentally driven by this physiological relaxation and the ability to practice incremental decision-making in a safe environment. The resulting moral benefit, that feeling of integrity, is secondary to the profound physiological benefit of systemic stress reduction. We heal the body by reducing the threat, which is the lack of agency, and the mind follows.
While stress reduction is certainly necessary, I believe it misses the unique dimension of depletion we're discussing. The material hints at a deeper, almost spiritual or moral fatigue that compounds the physical stress. And I come at it from a different way, specifically by considering the theological principles referenced in the source material. The biblical principle cited, that intent and the state of the heart are what truly matters, not circumstances outside one's control, that reinforces the profound weight of the conscious mind and intent.
Right, and we are agreed on the intent. The system does not condemn the person because the action was compelled.
Exactly. But even if there is no divine condemnation, the internal struggle between knowing the right, mastered action, and being systemically unable to enact it still extracts a profound psychological and physical toll. This internal tension, which is essentially the conscious mind fighting the imposed reality, creates a unique spiritual and moral fatigue. This specific self-inflicted strain, despite the lack of a traditional moral failing, it accelerates the physiological wear and the depletion of resilience mentioned in the text. This is a unique dimension of stress imposed by conscious self-knowledge that a generalized stress model simply cannot account for.
I understand you are focusing on the quality of the internal struggle, but this perspective, I think, actually supports my argument that the primary issue is constraint, not character. Since the action is compelled, it is a survival adaptation under duress. The pure takeaway in the source material explicitly frames this survival adaptation as evidence of resilience, not moral weakness, so framing the resulting physiological strain as hypocrisy risks misidentifying the primary enemy. If the source of the unique depletion is the systemic constraint, the financial limitations, the rigid institutional environment, then we should focus on the mechanism by which those external factors suppress physiological functions, like immunity and recovery.
But the question is, which mechanism is the accelerant? I agree that systemic constraints suppress immunity, but they do so by forcing the individual into a state of conscious misalignment. If they did not possess that conscious mastery or ethical awareness, the misalignment wouldn't generate the specific moral fatigue that so rapidly depletes their overall health and vitality. The ability to recognize the failure of alignment, the failure of integrity, is the catalyst that pushes generalized stress into the realm of rapid identity-based depletion. We must address the integrity gap to fully reverse the physical depletion.
But the systemic constraint itself is the accelerator. Let's just look at the limitations of circumstances and situations. Restrictive housing that prevents access to healthy food preparation, or financial instability that limits choice in medicine or self-care. These environments actively suppress the recovery of immunity and prosperity and health, regardless of the individual's inner moral judgment. The resulting stress is chronic, and it is a physical and neurobiological consequence of the environment conditioning the person to inhibit their natural, healthy self-expression. The integrity benefit follows the physiological relief from stress, which is why restoring autonomy and reducing environmental pressure absolutely must be the first step in regeneration.
So for me, the central takeaway remains clear. The unique mechanism of severe depletion in constrained environments is the profound tension created when conscious mastery of ethical conduct and self-care is blocked by overwhelming external forces. This hypocrisy under constraint is a deep source of physical, psychological, and ethical strain that demands recovery models focus specifically on restoring alignment between awareness, intention, and action to rebuild lasting vitality. The power of the conscious mind and the restoration of intentional integrity are, for me, paramount to health regeneration.
And while that internal conflict is undeniably real and generates immense psychological stress, the most effective path to regeneration focuses first on the physical and psychological necessities, reducing chronic stress and restoring choice. Depletion occurs because prolonged external control compromises executive function and hinders self-realization. The solution, therefore, lies in creating environments that support incremental gains in autonomy, enabling individuals to practice decision-making and rebuild self-efficacy, thereby lifting the immense physiological burden of systemic constraint.
Ultimately, both perspectives really illuminate the intricate interplay between agency, ethics, environment, and health. It demonstrates that resilience and vitality depend not just on compliance with external rules, but fundamentally on the integrated alignment of our conscious moral understanding and the practical capacity for action. It forces us to consider that integrity, even under duress, is a foundation of physical health,